Hello and welcome to The Chosen Few, the one and only place for you. My name is Isabel Santine, and my younger brother is, for all intents and purposes, blind in both eyes. He was born with congenital glaucoma, which is a potentially degenerative eye condition. In his case, he's been blind in one eye since birth, and more recently has lost almost all of his vision in his only seeing eye, being left only with light perception. Meanwhile, I kind of have a software obsession, and due to my brother's eye condition, he and I tend to think a lot about how most popular software packages aren't designed with screen readers in mind. I mean, even Discord on the PC barely works with his screen reader tool. This is a huge problem, and to make matters worse, my absolute favorite user interface framework and all the apps using it aren't accessible to disabled mobile users. If you are a Braille reader, it is not compatible with the Braille computer my brother uses. So, even though the framework can be used to create Android and iOS mobile apps, blind and visually impaired users still can't use them. In this video, join me as I figure out what our problem is, why it exists, and most importantly, how I fixed it and what that means for your apps. Let's jump in. Accessibility in software is a huge deal. Why are you joining us today?
Well, I suppose that I'd like to share my story in the hopes that accessible that I may be that my perspective on things may be able to give a give a voice to the accessibility software scene and sort of make developers aware of that experience and make them conscious of accessibility and be able to improve upon uh, accessibility as a part of software design.
For sure. And I'm really thankful that you're providing that to Chosen Few Software, and I'm glad to be able to give you this opportunity to give voice to accessibility and design in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
How does accessible design impact your daily life, in software or otherwise?
Well, accessibility is pretty much the core of everything that I do that involves any sort of reading or writing or anything that I do on the computer. I tend, you know, uh, anything that requires visual aid, I need a screen reader or something for because when 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 I had vision, I was able to use the computer quite
Mhm.
quickly. But um, with now that I don't have vision, it's pretty much instrumental to everything I do. Accessible software is pretty much critical to everything I do creatively and as far as things like research and other things go.
For sure.
And I would say that um any anything that involves correspondence with other people, it's also critical to my communication with people online because I don't I'm sort of gearing up right now to get a proper social life, I suppose. But I think that it's very important that there are accessible softwares for communication and messaging and stuff like that because for people like me have who have gone several steps back in my independence since
Mhm.
the vision loss experience, having a connection to communities that represent things I'm interested in is very important. And I think that having accessible software that serves that need is very important.
For sure. I agree 100%. Like, especially in terms of communication, like having accessible email readers, having accessible instant messaging clients, that's
Right.
super important to what you do on a daily basis.
Right. Yeah.
What are some of the tools you use to accommodate your unique needs?
Well, I think the one that I use, there are actually two that I use primarily. One is JAWS, which is a screen reader for Windows that has been in development since 1995 and is still being updated. And the other feature I use predominantly is VoiceOver on my iPad,
Mhm.
which is, excuse me, which I think is a very, I'm very grateful that that feature exists because, if, when I want to listen to music and stuff, it's very useful for getting around the streaming services and everything.
For sure.
And I also use a Braille Note Touch Android tablet. Basically it's basically a Braille writer slash computer that runs a modified version of Android. I
Mhm.
use that for a lot of my email stuff. Um, I use it for again, communication as well as
Mhm.
writing and reading, because it's one thing hearing a text to speech voice on a computer read something back to you versus using braille to read tactily and have your inner voice reading whatever you're reading to you.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
it's so I in that respect, I think that I do think that they are very useful tools.
Mhm. Yeah, I can imagine especially using, like, touch to interface with the computer. I imagine that's much more intuitive
Yeah, it
than
is.
using voice as, like, a mediary.
Yeah, because voice is because I use Osaro, which is a plugin for the Reaper DAW
Mhm.
that it basically makes it compatible with screen readers like JAWS, and it's a very useful tool. But often it reads a lot but it often have find myself having to mute the speech, so to toggle the speech on and off, because sometimes it just reads way too much, and
Yeah, for sure.
it's really hard for me to actually hear the whatever audio project I'm working on.
Mhm.
So that's another tool I use. But yeah, using touch is a very intuitive way, and especially knowing Braille I'm not sure if you would consider it its own language, but it's a language that interfaces with the existing English language.
For sure.
And
It's like a different way of writing it.
yeah, it's a different way of writing and reading it. And once you're able to learn how Braille works and make those connections in your brain through touch, then it's it's much easier for me to enjoy and sort of soak up whatever I'm reading or
For
writing.
sure. Mhm. How would it impact your life if every app and website you wanted to use could be properly read by a screen reader?
Well, it would make my life much much simpler and a lot more efficient, because because if accessible software design was universal,
Mhm.
then any navigation that I did between either the braille note or my computer or anything, like, and the applications and websites within those uh within those pieces of hardware, they it would be very seamless, and I think it would make be able to make me a lot more independent, because one of the things I run into a lot is that often I'll be browsing like a website like Wikipedia or something, which has
Mhm.
good accessibility, and then I'll go to a website that a say more modern website, or um, even like an older website, and it'll be completely different because the screen reader won't read like from one website to the next. It's kind of like you get variable like amounts of screen reader accessibility. So it's very convoluted and a bit frustrating. And the if that stuff were universal, I think I would be able to navigate the web and my other softwares a lot more seamlessly.
Totally. Yeah. I can imagine it's pretty jarring. Like, it would almost be like if every single website you visited used like a different theme. Like suddenly you would go from dark theme to light theme.
Right,
Like it
yeah.
would just feel inconsistent and like
Yeah.
be less accessible that way.
Yeah, it is definitely that way with a lot of websites. And another
Mhm.
thing that would be that if that stuff was universal, if accessibility was universal, um, I wouldn't need to ask for help for navigation of certain applications because there are some applications that just literally have no screen reader support, and I need to ask like either you or mom or dad or someone to just like help me click the button I want.
Yeah, for sure. And you already kinda covered this a little bit, but which of your senses do you rely on the most now that your functional vision is so limited?
Sound and touch. Sound
Mhm.
for pretty much anything. Sound, I use the screener for pretty much anything I need to do visually. Anything that is visible with the naked eye on a computer is or at least is supposed to be read described by the screen reader in a way
Mhm.
that's intuitive and efficient. Although it's not always that way. And as far as touch goes, I use it to interface with a braille keyboard. I use it to read braille and write braille. It's
Mhm.
and also generally just uh getting around and doing things around the house. I'll do a lot of that stuff tactily.
Yeah, for sure. I notice, for example, whenever you're walking around the house, you'll kinda, like, touch keep your fingers, like, grazing against the wall
Yeah.
so that you can kinda tell when each wall ends.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of ways that software can be implemented in kind of a similar way where you can kind of judge the boundaries of like each of the text fields and stuff completely tactily.
Yeah, that's something that I think is important is being able to know where you are on the screen
Mhm.
in a way that's efficient rather than because something I often find myself doing is just pressing the tab key on my keyboard like
Mhm.
50 times
Right.
just to get to a certain parameter that I want to adjust in Reaper or something like that.
For sure. What's your biggest pet peeve when it comes to accessibility in software design? In your mind, what does fixing this issue look like in practice?
Well, my biggest pet peeve with current accessible software is it reads too much that I don't need and it doesn't read enough what I do need.
Mhm.
So by designing websites and applications from an accessibility first standpoint and then
Mhm.
designing the rest of the software around that rather than designing everything everything for a sighted user and then implementing accessibility afterward because
Right.
it's it's a very that idea is kind of a very backwards process
Mhm.
inherently. I think that designing designing for the least able users first is going to make it better for literally everyone using the website, not just disabled people.
For sure, yeah. Because when you think about it, accessibility isn't just a feature that you tack on. Like you said, it's at the very core of the experience.
Exactly.
If you can't perceive or like even understand the software experience that you're trying to use, then there's no point in the rest of it. It's not useful.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, thing that that's the main thing that I think that would fix it is if software companies were conscious of accessibility and made sure and actually made sure to polish that accessibility rather than building a rudimentary framework for accessibility from the outset and then designing everything around it but not really checking with the accessibility framework and modifying it to sort of cater not just cater but to work with the things that they're designing around it because you want to always be thinking accessibility first. You don't want to create accessibility then like move on to other things and not come back to it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something that we even observed with my app later on in its development,
Yeah.
that we'd actually seen regressions in how it appeared using your Braille computer.
Yeah, exactly.
And we took very careful measures to ensure that that didn't happen again.
Yeah,
That accessibility is not only implemented initially, but it's also a core feature that we maintain as part of the development lifecycle.
yeah, exactly.
What does accessible software design mean to you? What are the biggest goals that developers should keep in mind when designing apps to be accessible for visually impaired users?
I think that accessible to accessible software, in my mind at least, means that regardless of what disability a person may have, um, it the navigation of the website or program needs to be as easy or close to as easy as it is for sighted users.
Mm-hmm.
And this often means, I think, especially for visually impaired users, I think this means for developers of accessible software, it means sort of doing away with fancy clutter of like websites, like
Mm-hmm.
doing really I think it means sort of doing away with really fancy UI design, and I think it also means designing the website in a manner that is structurally efficient. You know, you want everything to be, you want every element of your site or program to be placed or coded in a manner that is that, with something like a keyboard shortcut, you can instantly go to that menu item. Or
Like it's predictable, right?
yeah, it's predictable, and it's not, and people don't get lost in the details,
Mm-hmm.
and again, make it structurally efficient in that you can like get to things easily without needing to do a lot of searching around,
For sure.
and just like going through a long list of menu items just to get to the one thing you want.
Mm-hmm. And finally, our last question for the day. If you could tell every developer in the world one thing about accessibility in software, what would it be?
I think that the thing I would say is that, developers should be aware should be aware of the tools in which blind users use their software. And what I mean
Mm-hmm.
by this is, like, they like I encourage developers, every developer, to get at least familiar with how a screen reader works, and and probably most importantly, test the website or program they're developing with a screen reader.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know basically, it's basically kind of a put yourself in their shoes scenario.
For sure.
Like, like I would literally encourage developers to wear a blindfold and try and use the website or program they're developing with a screen reader,
Mm-hmm.
to see how frustrating or like, how easy it is.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think if developers had that conscious experience, it would, one, I think, develop sympathy and initiative for positive change and accessibility,
Mm-hmm.
and two, make it easier for everyone else covering that covering that ground with screen readers and with braille computers and stuff, and making sure that their software is properly labeled. Each item in their website or program is properly labeled and is easily accessible.
Mm-hmm.
I think that developers should be aware of keyboard shortcuts specific to the screen readers, and work and design their software based on that knowledge, and be able, and again, just sort of familiarizing themselves with the blind experience
For
in
sure.
order to just sort of get an idea of what it's like for people like me, and um how it is for so many others who yearn to be very creative and productive people, but often can't, due to the just sort of lack of accessibility in the greater software scheme.
Totally. Thank you so much, Eli, for being on the show. We really appreciate you sharing your perspective, sharing your story. That's really important, and I'm so thankful that you stepped up in this way for us.
Yeah, no problem.
Now that we have a better handle on this big, big problem, let's fix it. Our solution will work for all Android devices supported by Avalonia, the UI framework I mentioned at the beginning of this video. In the future, I also want to add support for iOS devices like iPads and iPhones, but Eli needs my app to work on his Braille computer first. This is a map of our solution. So the first thing that we have is our app. And this app has some content inside of it. And underneath this app, we have text fields, we have buttons. So then outside of the app, we also have what we call an accessibility delegate. And this accessibility delegate talks to all of these controls. And what this accessibility delegate does is it tells the operating system that these controls have various properties, which can include text, it can include actions that we might perform on these buttons, and essentially the flow of control goes from the app to the controls, to the delegate, to the OS. And that's how the OS becomes then aware of how to present all of this useful metadata about the user interface to the user in the most accessible way possible. Now that we have this all tidied up, we have one last hurdle to jump. Does it work for Eli?
There we go. Contacts, view.
Oh, you can read that on the Braille display?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Invite friend. Let's see. Start conversation. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be updating the display when I do save changes. Is that because it didn't change the screen?
That's a good question.
Oh, okay. Now I think I contact Izzy. Start conversation.
Yep.
Yeah, for some reason it doesn't show the text. It doesn't show the text I'm writing.
Oh,
It's just the brackets to indicate like the text field, but it doesn't
Mhm.
show the text, so you might want to look into that.
Yeah, for sure. That's good feedback.
Did it do a new line or did it send?
Neither. Then you have to go to the send button.
Oh, gotcha.
So that's another thing I should maybe fix.
Yeah.
But that's really cool. The fact that you are mostly able to intelligibly navigate the interface and everything.
Yeah.
That counts for a lot. I think that this was a really productive session.
Yeah, I think so.
At the end of all this, there's one key moment from our journey that sticks out to me. We talked to Eli about what his needs are as a visually impaired digital citizen. This is honestly the biggest and most important part of everything in this video. Why? Because accessibility starts with the user. Not every user can see. Not every user can hear. Not every user can perceive colors like everyone else can. Everyone thinks differently, too, experiencing and approaching the software they use in vastly different ways. That said, not every tool will work for everyone, but if every app developer just put that little bit more thought into accessibility and how different users' needs impact their designs, from conception to final product, we'd be just that much closer to a software world that works for everyone, can be accessed, used, and enjoyed by all of us. So, did I fix my app? Yes. Did I fix hundreds of other apps similar to mine? Yes, indeed. But are we done here? Did we solve accessibility in software once and for all? Decidedly not. There's always a better app, and it's always one iteration away. Thanks for watching. Bye.